If you're a newer teacher who's struggling with delivering lessons in terms of how to actually teach a new concept, break down that concept that's easy to understand, and facilitate practice, then this video is for you. You'll learn the best methods for teaching, whether you are introducing a new concept or reviewing or reteaching, how to explain the concepts in multiple ways so that students really understand it, as well as how to get the students to practice it in an effective way so that the learning is sticky. After this video, you'll finally get unstuck and stop feeling like your lessons are flopping. If this is the type of video that you need, or maybe even needed a few years ago, then consider delivering a tap on the like and subscribe button so that the YouTube algorithm will deliver this to other people who are also struggling with teaching lessons. So this video is going to be split into two parts. First, it's going to be delivering a new concept for the first time, and then the second half is going to be reteaching or reviewing that same concept. So the first way to deliver a new concept is the one that we probably use the most, and that's lecture. Now, lecturing kind of gets a bad reputation, but it's actually really effective if you do it in small chunks and if you basically do it the right way. Now, instead of just standing in the front of the classroom talking and having students looking at your face, the best way to do this is by pairing it with some type of visual or image. So sometimes this could be something like a PowerPoint or a Google slide, just something that students can look at that is giving a visual representation of what you're saying. But we want to be careful that whatever kind of a presentation that we're using, it doesn't have a bunch of text on it, especially text with bullet points, and you're just reading those bullet points. There's a reason why it's called death by PowerPoint, because people just get really bored when someone is reading off the screen. Now, if you do have a resource where it's slides with text on it, the best way to use these is to actually give it to your students. So you can print it out, which is a little bit tedious, but you could print it out, maybe one set for a group or just a class set, and each student gets to read it during class and then the next class gets to read it too. Or you could also, if you're using tablets or laptops, you can disseminate it digitally to your students and they could just read it on their own. If you're going to use direct teaching or lecturing, plan to break it down into small chunks interspersed with some kind of student participation or discussion. So this might look like 2 minutes of teaching the first part of a concept, ask the student a question, and then have them discuss it or answer out loud, and then keep on lecturing. You'll make your life a lot easier if you have these questions already prepared ahead of time so that you know exactly when to stop, and when you make that first stop, you know exactly what to ask the students. That way you're not winging it and just kind of like making up something on the fly. And so after you ask that questions, you can either just have the students think and write it down, or you could just have them think about it and raise their hand and answer out. But honestly, the best way is to have them think for a little bit, talk to their partner or their group, and then maybe pull some participation cards or have students raise their hand and volunteer the answer. Now, with this particular method of teaching, one of the best ways to make it stick with students and to make it so they're not as bored is to use analogies or examples whenever possible. If you just teach a concept without letting somebody practice, it's kind of like showing someone how to cook a dish, like you go from start to finish with preparing it and actually cooking it on the stove, and then they don't actually get to practice it until the end. They just watch you. Well, they're going to forget all of the steps along the way. It would have been better if you had them try it along the way, maybe started certain processes and let them finish, taste it along the way so they know what it's supposed to taste like in different parts of the recipe, and then they can successfully do that on their own. So that was an analogy that I used with this particular example. The best thing that you can do is to plan those analogies and examples ahead of time and write them down, because again, trying to wing it or trying to make it up on the fly can be really hard. Now, if you watched my previous video where I discussed how to make your lessons more engaging, I did talk about relevancy in terms of how it would apply to students' lives, maybe pull in some pop culture in there so that students can say, oh, okay, I get it now. And if you missed that video, I'm going to put a link up here as well as the description box below. Also, after you've given an example, if you have a class that particularly likes to participate, you can also have them come up with examples and analogies, and that could be kind of fun. Now, a lot of times when teachers do direct teaching or lecture, they have students take notes, but that can also get really tedious and boring. So one thing that you can do is to break it up into smaller chunks, again, just like with your lectures, but also ask students to give a visual representation representation, like some kind of a drawing or a doodle that represents what it is that you just said. And it doesn't have to be pretty. They can use stick figures or whatever helps them really process what you taught them in a different way. So you have them writing in words as well as images. So lecturing is definitely one of the more popular and common ways of delivering a new idea or concept. But along with that is also reading a text. One of the benefits of reading a text is that, as I mentioned before, it gives them a visual representation. Sometimes students, they'll hear you talking, but it's not processing. They actually have to read it or see it in writing or on their screen in order for them to actually process it. This is especially true if you have special ed students or English learners who may not completely understand what you're saying, or it's just too much information at once. The benefit of having them read a text is that they can go over and over again over the text until they actually understand it, or they can go as slow or as fast as they need. Now, if you choose to go this route and you can prepare your own materials, it really helps to have maybe 2 columns where one side you have the text, and then on the margin or on the other side you have some guiding questions or hints for students. Now, if you're using, say, like a textbook where it's already printed out and all the space is taken up, you can have some kind of a worksheet next to them that has those guiding questions or hints so that the students can best process the information in case it becomes overwhelming. Also, break the text up into smaller chunks, especially if it's a longer text. So maybe you're going to give them 2 to 4 paragraphs to read, and then after that point they're going to answer some questions or take some notes, draw a picture, something like that, just so that you make sure that they don't just read endlessly. Also, there comes a point, and I'm sure this has happened to you, where you're just reading and after a while your eyes are just going over the words and you don't remember what you're reading. So it's best to just break it up into just a few paragraphs at a time before you sort of break them and then have them do something else and then they go back. I also know that some teachers like to have the students break up the paragraphs in their groups, so one person will read the first paragraph, next person reads the second paragraph, etc., and they read it out loud to the group, and that still help them focus and sort of break up the monotony. And I sometimes do that. The thing about that I've found, though, is that it really depends on the class, because if you have a class with struggling readers, a lot of times they don't want to read out loud and they get embarrassed because they're tripping over words. So you know your class better than I do, and you'll know if this is a method that would work. Finally, you could have the students learn the material ahead of time, usually with a textbook or online, and then you discuss it later in class. So how this would work is you would give them the resources. Maybe it's a text or a video or something like that, and they're going to learn the concept ahead of time and maybe do some practice. And then the next day in class, you're going to discuss it with them, and then you're going to do extra practice with them in class, and you're going to explain it as you practice with them. Now, this is called flipping because the students are supposed to be learning on their own. They're in charge of their learning as if they are their own teacher, and you're there to guide them through the practice part. And it can actually be really beneficial because the students, again, can go at their own pace, and you're less likely to have to reteach it because they're learning on their own. And it's also really awesome if you have a really wide range of students in your class because they can go as fast or as slow as they need. And they also have the benefit of hearing or reading the material twice because they learned it before class and then you're discussing it again during class. So again, really solidifying the concepts here. So like in a math class, you could have the student read a little bit about this concept like in their textbook, and then you're going to give them a couple of practice questions that they're going to try to do on their own. You're just going to have them struggle and see what they can do. And then the next day when you're in class, you're going to go over those homework problems and break it down and essentially reteach it and then have them practice again. One benefit of doing that is that when they're doing the work, they can ask you questions. You probably know how frustrating it can be to get those problems that you have to do at home and you have to try to work it out yourself and you're totally confused and you have no one to ask. Well, they're working on those problems in class and luckily you're there or their peers are there to help them, so there's a lot less frustration. So I'm curious, are you the type of teacher that likes to do some direct teaching? Do you use a lot of text to teach your students? Are you doing a flipped learning model or maybe a hybrid of all three? Let me know in the comments below because I'm super curious where you're at with that. If you're reteaching or reviewing, you can still use the other three methods. However, your students might get kind of bored because they're like, this again. So here's what else you can do. First, you can give the students a video to watch. So this is probably going to be the exact same material that you gave them before. It could even be the same lecture, but it's from someone else. And usually because it's a video, there's other graphics and video representations that are a lot more exciting than you. I hate to say it, but it could be exactly the same and they're bored with you, but they find the video strangely satisfying. And since they already learned this material before, you're going to follow up with a more complex activity because you want to see just how well they know it. It could be something like more complex math problems, a more involved write-up, or maybe a class discussion like a Socratic seminar. But the expectation is that since this is the second time that they're learning this material, they can go deeper with the concept. And at this point, if you have some students that are still struggling, you can either give them additional videos to watch or additional text to read, or you can also pull some of the students aside for some small group instruction, and then you can maybe practice more problems or you can practice that concept with them further. And another way to either reteach or review is to give them a problem to solve. Now, considering that they have Google, they just basically have the internet at their fingertips, and it's really easy for them to learn concepts on their own. In fact, I know a lot of students go on TikTok and they learn things about health and religion and politics and all of that, so they could potentially learn this information on their own and then apply it in a really meaningful way. And what I love about it is that it forces students to be resourceful. It requires them to do things like a proper search. You'd be surprised how many students really don't know how to search properly, and they just take the first couple of results on Google without actually thinking if it's a valid resource. So in this scenario, it takes a lot of planning because you're not doing the direct teaching, right? So what you're doing is you're more of a facilitator and you have to plan out the activities, because if you just tell the students, okay, solve this problem, and they're going to be on their own, they could take days trying to solve that, or for some students, they're going to take maybe an hour. So you really have to plan out all the steps and what they should accomplish each day. You're kind of like a project manager. You're also going to want to try to do this project yourself or solve this problem yourself so that you can anticipate the problems and roadblocks that they're going to run into. Maybe on your internet at your district, they're blocking certain sites that students need. So you're going to need to find alternate sites that they can use so that they don't sit there being frustrated. You're also going to want to do some scaffolding in terms of supplementing with things like graphic organizers, especially for students that struggle with something like a big picture project, because they're going to need a way to organize their thoughts and collect the data. So you want to have that prepared ahead of time. Even for some of your special ed students, you might want to even put like the websites that they can go to and just like really direct them, because for some students, the lack of direction can be really overwhelming for them. Or even worse, with a lack of direction, they don't accomplish anything. They just sit there and do whatever they want because they don't really know what they're supposed to do. So some examples of this could be researching the best type of pet for different housing situations in different parts of the world, or creating a care plan for different plants, also depending on the type of housing situation or climate that you live in. Maybe having them plan how to build floating shelves to house their 10 trophies that weigh a certain amount, or helping someone choose a place to eat in a city that they're going to visit by comparing and contrasting two different restaurants. One thing that's great about this method is that you can have them learn multiple standards just from this one project. And also you can pull some of the other teaching methods that I mentioned earlier with like direct teaching and videos and things like that to supplement this particular method of teaching. It's also great because it's a real world application of what you're teaching the students, and that's going to lead into more buy-in. As I mentioned in my last video, students are more engaged when their learning is relevant and applies to real world problems and applies to their lives. So when you do something like this, you're going to get a lot more participation and engagement. But again, just be sure that you know that it's going to involve a lot of planning and that you're prepared to constantly monitor the students. You also want to have a solid rubric so that you can objectively grade these different projects. So whether you already knew about these different methods or you didn't really think about them, just know that you can mix and match these depending on how complex of a concept it is that you're teaching. And it's really important to make sure that you're not the focus of this learning learning. You're just helping them get the information. The focus is on them actually doing something with this information, whether it's practicing by themselves, in a group, or applying it to some kind of real world situation. And if you've been using one method the majority of time, think about incorporating other methods, or maybe replacing it with another method and seeing how that works with your students, or maybe do a hybrid. It's really important to always look at how your students are doing, how they're responding to the way that you're teaching, and then adjusting to their needs. If your students are at a point where no matter how you teach, they're just not engaged or paying attention, be sure to click on this video next so that you can see if you are guilty of the 3 bad habits that are killing student engagement.